A pathetic, broke military failure. Like, you could never get your hands on this kind of money unless you were doing something rotten and illegal. My sister Natalie's hiss was as sharp as a knife. Right in front of my terrified son's eyes, she snatched the $5 million check, ripped it in half, and threw the shredded pieces straight down onto my scuffed combat boots. That deafening sound of tearing paper shredded whatever was left of our blood tie. Call the police. Arrest this embezzling thief right now. Natalie screamed in triumph, gleefully trampling over her younger sister's dignity in the middle of the crowded lobby. Watching the children's fun check flutter to the marble floor, I tightened my grip on my son's hand, my eyes turning terrifyingly cold. I stood perfectly still, offering zero resistance, because what she didn't know was that her arrogant phone call had just detonated a classified $750 million contract, one powerful enough to wipe the entire existence of this bank off the map. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. As the white torn confetti of that shredded $5 million check drifted through the frigid recycled air and settled onto the mud-stained leather of my combat boots, the stinging humiliation yanked my mind backward, not forward, backward, straight into a wound I had spent years trying to bury under discipline and silence, and the smell of engine grease on an overseas military base 10,000 meters from home. I stared down at the frayed hem of my faded tactical jacket. It was the exact same piece of clothing my ex-husband had pointed at, with absolute disgust years ago, the night he packed his bags and walked out of our lives for good. He had stood in our cramped little living room, his leather suitcase already zipped his car keys, jangling impatiently in his left hand, and jabbed his index finger at the olive drab fabric hanging over the kitchen chair. He called my dedication to the country a pathetic excuse for financial failure. He said our son would grow up ashamed of a mother who chose mud and gunfire over a real paycheck. He said he had found someone who understood what a man actually deserved, a billionaire A's in the city, who could give him the life I was too stubborn and too poor to provide. I had been standing at the kitchen sink washing our son's plastic cereal bowl when he delivered that final verdict on our marriage. I remember the warm water running over my knuckles. I remember the soap bubbles sliding between my fingers. I remember the exact pitch of his voice when he said, "Our boy would be better off without me." He did not kiss our son goodbye. He did not even glance at the bedroom door, where the boy was sleeping, with his stuffed dinosaur pressed against his cheek. He just slammed the front door so hard, the framed photo of our wedding crashed off the wall and shattered across the linoleum, sending tiny shards of glass sliding under the refrigerator, where I would find them with my bare feet. 3 days later, still bleeding from wounds I could not see. The memory of that sneer burned in my chest like battery acid every single day. My own family had always measured a soldier's sacrifice in dollars and cents, and the number never added up in their eyes. My sister had openly sided with my ex-husband during the divorce. She told our parents I had driven him away with my stubbornness. She told anyone who would listen that I deserved to be alone. I swallowed that bitter memory whole, grinding my heavy boots into the polished marble floor, pulling my consciousness back to the exact reason I had walked into this superficial fortress just 15 minutes earlier. Only 15 minutes before this explosive confrontation, my son and I had parked our beat-up, reliable old truck in the sprawling luxury car-filled parking lot of Holstead Bank's Ellsworth branch. The truck's exhaust pipe rattled against the undercarriage as I killed the engine. A fine layer of red dust from the unpaved road leading out of Maple Hollow coated the hood and the cracked windshield. My son unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his small backpack, the one with the torn zipper he refused to replace, because his best friend at school had drawn a lopsided dinosaur on it with permanent marker during recess. He slung it over one shoulder and waited for me to come around and open his door, a small ritual we had maintained since he was old enough to ride in the front seat. We had a remarkably simple plan for the afternoon: deposit the government funds at the bank, walk 3 blocks down Main Street to the bookstore, and buy him the new comic books he had been saving his allowance for. Finish the day eating pulled pork sandwiches and sweet potato fries at our favorite local barbecue joint near the highway overpass, the one with the neon pig sign that buzzed and flickered every time a truck rumbled past. That was it. No spectacle, no drama, just a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I had purposefully kept my true identity entirely hidden from the world for years. Not a single teacher at my son's elementary school, nor any of my quiet neighbors on the gravel roads of Maple Hollow knew the truth. They saw a tired single mom in dusty clothes, who drove an old truck, mowed her own lawn on Saturday mornings, and hung her laundry on a clothesline in the backyard. They had absolutely no idea that beneath this exhausted exterior, I was a full-bird colonel in the United States Marine Corps, a high-ranking Department of Defense representative, personally coordinating hundreds of millions of dollars in veteran housing and pension funds across 17 states. I kept this absolute secrecy by choice, by iron discipline. I desperately wanted my son to learn that a person's core character, their integrity, their word, and their honor define a human being, not a designer label or the emblem on the hood of a sports car. I wanted him to grow up untouched by the toxic disease of materialism that had rotted my sister's soul from the inside out, the same disease that had stolen my husband from our kitchen table. The very second we pushed through the heavy oversized glass doors and stepped into the bank's VIP lobby, the ambient temperature dropped like walking into a meat locker. The sprawling room reeked of expensive espresso and suffocating entitlement. The floors were polished marble so reflective I could see the scuffed soles of my boots looking back up at me. 3 young tellers stood behind the long counter, laughing idly and scrolling through their phones. The instant their eyes scanned my faded olive-drab cargo pants, my weathered face, and my son's plain, slightly wrinkled cotton shirt, their bright, welcoming smiles evaporated into thin air. One of them nudged her colleague with her elbow and whispered something behind her manicured hand. The second teller glanced at us, wrinkled her nose slightly, and turned her back. They did not even try to hide it. We were immediately silently classified as trash. I watched with clinical detachment as men in sharply tailored thousand suits and women carrying designer handbags, the size of small suitcases, were greeted with deep fawning bows and immediate personalized assistance. A silver-haired gentleman carrying a golf bag received a fresh cappuccino before he even reached the counter. A woman in heels so tall they clicked like metronomes on the marble was personally escorted to a private consultation room by a manager who nearly bowed in half. Meanwhile, my son and I stood at the entrance like invisible, bothersome ghosts. The thick, oppressive stench of classism choked the room. Without speaking a single word, the entire banking staff had drawn a line in the polished marble, deciding that a woman in scuffed boots and a boy in a wrinkled shirt did not deserve basic human dignity. I had seen this exact dynamic play out in combat zones around the world. The powerful ignore the vulnerable. The uniformed serve, the served forget. I felt my son tighten his small trembling grip on my fingers. His intuition was sharper than any military radar I had ever operated. He sensed the hostility, radiating from the staff like heat rising off desert asphalt. Instead of shrinking away or turning back to the safety of our truck, I did not retreat a single inch. I took a controlled breath through my nose and straightened my spine, feeling the familiar comforting rigidity of 20 years of Marine Corps discipline take over my body. I locked my posture into the unbreakable squared shoulder stance I had used walking through combat zones on 3 different continents. The official red-stamped $5 million government check sat inside my breast pocket, pressed flat against my chest, feeling as heavy and secure as a plate of Kevlar armor. Holding my son's hand firmly in mine, I marched directly toward the central transaction counter. My eyes stayed fixed. My expression was carved from granite. I was completely blissfully unaware that by taking those calm, deliberate steps forward, I was walking straight into the slaughterhouse of my sister's fragile, malignant ego, and that the quiet Tuesday afternoon was about to detonate into absolute chaos. The silent, icy ostracization from the banking staff was so blunt and unapologetic that even an 8-year-old child could feel the sting of it in his bones. My son stopped walking. He tugged gently at the sleeve of my faded jacket, pulling the fabric toward his chin, forcing me to halt and look down at him. His large round eyes were welling up with a confusion so pure and so painful it could crack reinforced steel. He leaned his small body against my leg, trying to shrink himself, trying to disappear behind me, and away from the glaring, dismissive eyes of the security guards posted near the counter. In a hushed, trembling whisper, he asked me why the nicely dressed men and women in this beautiful building were not smiling and friendly, like the cashiers at our local grocery store back home. He asked me if we had done something wrong. He asked if it was because of his backpack. My heart cracked inside my chest, a fracture I could physically feel running from my sternum to the base of my throat. He was being brutally exposed to the raw, ugly face of social prejudice for the very first time in his short life. The pain of watching my child internalize that silent rejection, watching him search his own small conscience for a fault that did not exist, trying to find something wrong with his backpack or his shirt, to explain why the adults in the room refused to look at him, ignited a quiet protective fury deep within my gut that no amount of military training could fully contain. I immediately dropped to one knee right in the middle of that gleaming marble floor, the cold stone pressing hard through my cargo pants. I deliberately used my own body as a physical shield, blocking out the sneering, judgmental stares of the bank staff behind me. I placed my calloused hands gently on his small shoulders, feeling his thin bones beneath the cotton, and brushed his soft hair back from his forehead. I locked my eyes firmly with his, refusing to let him absorb their toxic contempt. "Be patient, sweetheart," I whispered softly, projecting absolute warmth and stability into every syllable. "Never assume the worst about anyone before you truly know them. We came here for a mission, and we will complete it." I squeezed his shoulder once, firmly, transferring my quiet strength into his small frame. He needed to understand that true resilience means maintaining your own internal honor and composure, even when the rest of the world decides to treat you with baseless, cruel contempt. He needed to know it was never his fault. He nodded slowly. He straightened his small back. He was my son. He was a soldier's son. I stood back up to my full height, rolled my shoulders back, and reinforced my mental armor for whatever lay ahead at the counter. The lobby's ambient noise, the clicking of keyboards, the murmur of polite transactions between wealthy clients and fawning tellers suddenly fell away. The heavy frosted glass door of the branch manager's private corner office swung open with a sharp, deliberate click that echoed across the marble like a pistol being cocked. My sister stepped out. Natalie was dressed in an immaculate tailor-made designer suit that likely cost more than my truck's blue book value. Her hair was sculpted into a flawless wave, her nails freshly lacquered in deep crimson, and she reek of expensive perfume, the kind that announced a person's arrival 3 full seconds before their body followed. Her sharp, calculating eyes scanned the lobby with the practiced authority of a woman who had built her entire identity around controlling this room, and they instantly locked onto my position across the floor. I stood perfectly still, searching her powdered face for even a fleeting flicker of familiar warmth, a trace of recognition, a shadow of the girl who once braided my hair before school. I found absolutely nothing. There was only a predatory cold disdain as her gaze swept violently from my dusty combat boots, up my faded jacket, across my son's cheap cotton shirt, and his dinosaur backpack, and back to my weathered face. In a fraction of a second, her eyes completed a brutal silent arithmetic, instantly assessing my financial worth and dismissing my entire existence as a humiliating stain on her pristine elite domain. She had made her calculation. I was worth less than the espresso she served her VIP clients. I braced myself for the inevitable impact, shifting my weight into a defensive, grounded stance. I read her aggressive body language the exact same way I would read an enemy combatant approaching a checkpoint on a hostile perimeter. The arrogantly lifted chin, the rigid, tense shoulders, the cruel, lopsided smirk of absolute superiority forming on her painted lips. Snorts, she was actively preparing for a public execution, eager to showcase her dominance in front of her wealthy clientele. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I took 3 long, deliberate strides, stepping right up to the cold, thick glass of the VIP transaction counter. I reached into my breast pocket, maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with her the entire time. With slow, measured precision, I extracted the heavily stamped document and slid the $5 million government check onto the smooth surface of the counter. I laid down my opening move in a psychological war I never wanted to fight, setting the stage for the explosive collision of our two fundamentally incompatible worlds. My sister marched up to the counter with the clicking precision of her designer heels and stared down at the long, impossible string of zeros printed on the government check. Her pupils dilated, not with professional curiosity, not with the composed interest of a competent bank manager verifying a legitimate document. Her eyes widened with pure, unadulterated, venomous envy. The horrifying thought that her failure of a younger sister, the one who supposedly threw her life away in the mud and misery of the military, currently held millions of dollars in authorized government funds, completely shattered her fragile, status-obsessed ego. Unable to process the reality in front of her, her malice took over like a virus seizing a weakened host. She intentionally raised her shrill theatrical voice to a piercing volume, explicitly ensuring that the sound carried across the entire VIP hall to draw the maximum audience. She wanted witnesses. She needed spectators for the execution she was about to perform. A pathetic failure earning pennies like you. How could you possibly have a $5 million check in your hands? She hissed viciously, her painted lips curling back from her teeth like a cornered animal. She stood right there under the bright crystal chandeliers and publicly accused me of embezzlement and fraud, weaponizing our shared bloodline and her managerial authority to maximize the humiliation in front of every wealthy stranger within earshot. Her tellers stopped working. Her security guard stepped closer. The trap was being built in real time, and she was the architect. I did not flinch. I did not allow a single muscle in my face to betray any emotional pain. With the clinical emotionless precision forged in life-or-death combat zones across 3 continents and 2 decades of active service, I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I extracted my heavy, high-ranking military identification card alongside the thick stack of red-stamped official Department of Defense authorization paperwork. I slapped the entire stack onto the glass counter with a sharp, authoritative crack that silenced the immediate area like a gunshot fired into a church ceiling. The tellers flinched. The security guard nearest to me took a step back. I looked dead into my sister's frantic, jealous eyes. I am asking you to put your childish personal grudges aside. Do your job like a professional. You can pick up the phone call, the military treasury hotline, and everything will be verified in less than 2 minutes. My voice was a low, controlled rumble, offering her a perfectly rational, professional exit from the hysterical trap she was building around herself and everyone else in this room. 2 minutes. That was all it would take. 1 phone call, and this entire disaster could have been averted. I was handing her a lifeline wrapped in military precision, and she could not even see it through the fog of her own jealousy. From behind the marble counter, a young, nervous teller stepped forward, breaking the tense standoff. Her name tag read, Maya Jenkins. She had barely entered her mid-20s with close-cropped hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that burned with a sudden flash of integrity that outshone every other person in that building combined. Coming from a proud veteran family, her own father, having served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb, took his left leg below the knee. She had recognized my colonel insignia and the Department of Defense seals the instant I placed them on the glass, her hands trembling slightly with the courage of what she was about to do. She bravely stepped to the counter and offered to take the documents to the back verification room and make the confirmation call herself. She wanted to resolve this quietly, professionally, the way any competent banking institution should have handled it from the very first second. My sister snapped her head toward the young girl with terrifying speed, her perfectly styled hair whipping across her shoulder. Her eyes went wide with a demonic, uncontrolled rage at having her absolute authority questioned by a subordinate, a junior teller, a nobody. Without a second thought, Natalie leaned over the counter and brutally threatened to fire Maya on the spot. Snorts, she promised to permanently blacklist her name in the entire banking industry. She swore to contact every financial institution in the state and ensure that Maya Jenkins would never work behind another counter again, that she would lose her apartment, her health insurance. Everything she had built since her father's life's medical retirement left the family financially gutted. It was a flawless execution of psychological warfare, designed to instantly crush the only person in the entire room with enough decency and courage to stand at my side. Maya shrank back instantly, burying her face in her trembling hands, weeping in helpless terror as she retreated to the far wall, behind the counter. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She pressed her back against the filing cabinets and slid down until she was crouching her name tag, catching the overhead light as her chest heaved. Having successfully crushed the only sliver of decency and honor in the entire building, my sister turned her arrogant, victorious sneer back to me. She was drunk on her own fabricated power. Intoxicated by the authority she held over every person on her payroll, she actively refused to even glance at the authentic government seals, the watermarks, the undeniable proof of my rank and authorization lying right in front of her on the glass. Verification was never her goal. My destruction was the goal. It had always been the goal from the moment I walked through those doors in clothes she considered beneath her. She reached out with one hand and flicked my official military ID with a sharp, manicured fingernail, the way someone would flick a dead roach off a dinner plate. Her face dripped with absolute, unshakable contempt. "You think these worthless scraps of paper can fool me?" She scoffed loudly, tossing her perfect hair over her shoulder and planting her fists on her hips. By utterly rejecting the hard, factual truth, she locked the doors on her own fate, welded them shut, and swallowed the key. She chose to escalate the situation into a full-blown public spectacle because her ego simply could not allow her younger sister to stand taller than her, not even for 2 minutes, not even with proof. The piercing volume of my sister's accusations acted like a dinner bell for every opportunistic bystander in the building. The tension at the counter bled out into the lobby like blood in shark-infested water. Dozens of customers abandoned their deposit slips, and private transactions drifting toward us in a slow predatory migration, forming a tight, suffocating crescent around the counter. Like a synchronized, mindless reflex, smartphones were drawn from pockets and designer purses all around us. Lenses were thrust forward, camera flashes fired in staccato bursts. Every angle of our humiliation was being captured in high definition, broadcast-ready content for platforms that would amplify our suffering into millions of views. Not a single person in that growing mob stepped forward to ask a question to seek the truth, or to diffuse the escalating confrontation. They were vultures, pure vultures, thirsting for a spectacle to feed their empty, superficial lives on social media, already composing their captions before the scene had even played out. The rising heat of their bodies pressing closer, the smell of cologne and hairspray and dry-cleaned fabric turned the vast marble lobby into a claustrophobic cage, trapping my son and me in the dead center of their entertainment. From the middle of the filming crowd, a man shouldered his way aggressively to the front. Charles Montgomery. I did not know his name at that moment, but I would learn it later from the police report. He was a local figure notorious in this branch for his desperate, pathetic campaign to win VIP status by ingratiating himself with the management. He wore a suit that was expensive, but poorly fitted the fabric, straining at the buttons, and a gold watch he made sure to flash every time he gestured. He saw an opportunity to score points with the branch manager, and he lunged for it. He barked a loud, theatrical laugh that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "Manager Price is absolutely right. Just look at this ragged disgrace. She is a walking embarrassment to the military. She is probably using her own child as a prop in some pathetic, poor single mother scam to swindle sympathy money from this bank." His fat finger pointed directly at my son as he delivered that last line. His words were not just insults. They were razor blades, specifically designed to slice into my son's innocent mind. He was weaponizing a child's presence, exploiting an 8-year-old boy's tears just to curry favor with a corrupt bank manager. The crowd around him nodded. Some laughed. The sickness was contagious. My son recoiled in sheer terror at the man's booming cruelty. His small knuckles turned entirely white as he grabbed fistfuls of my faded combat pants, pressing his face hard against my thigh, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible behind my legs. I felt the wetness of his tears soaking through the fabric onto my skin. The blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. The protective fury of a mother and the lethal hardwired instincts of a Marine colonel collided inside my chest like two freight trains, but I forced them both down into a steel vault of discipline. I would not give these people the show they wanted. I locked my cold, dead eyes onto my sister's manicured face, offering her one absolute final chance at salvation before I destroyed her career permanently. Natalie, stop before you have no way back. Do not let your prejudice blind you. I warned her, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that I had only ever used when issuing final orders before a combat engagement. It was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. Harder than any firefight. Harder than any midnight patrol in hostile territory. Deploying military-grade restraint to warn an enemy who happened to share my blood, who happened to have slept in the bed next to mine for the first 16 years of our lives. My sincere final warning was met with a smirk of pure, unadulterated evil. Drunk on the validation of the cheering crowd, high on the fumes of her own manufactured power, she lifted the $5 million government check high into the air for everyone to see. She held it above her head like a trophy. With a vicious theatrical pull, she tore it directly in half. The sound cut through the lobby. Then she ripped it again and again. She turned the multi-million-dollar children's fund into worthless confetti and threw the shredded pieces violently into the air, letting them flutter down onto my scuffed boots, onto the marble, onto the dinosaur backpack my son had pressed against his chest. That is where people like you belong, she snarled, her voice dripping with 3 decades of concentrated venom and unchecked superiority. My son instinctively dropped to his knees. His small fingers scrambled across the cold marble, trying to gather the torn pieces, trying to put the check back together, as if reassembling the paper could somehow reassemble everything else that was shattering around him. I grabbed his shoulder firmly and pulled him back up to his feet. I would never let my child kneel before her. Not today. Not any day. Not in this life. I looked right through her hollow soul, past the designer suit, past the perfume, past every mask she had ever constructed to hide the rot underneath. You just ended your own life with your own hands, Natalie, I stated. My voice did not rise. My hands did not shake. The words landed on the marble floor between us with the finality of a coffin lid closing. That was the exact moment she picked up her desk phone, dialed security, and screamed for the police, following her hysterical, completely fabricated police call. My sister pointed a manicured finger at me and barked an aggressive order to her head of security, Marcus Vance. He was a giant, lumbering man with a shaved head, a thick neck, and hands the size of dinner plates. The kind of man who clearly enjoyed bullying anyone he deemed physically weaker to justify his inflated paycheck and earn approving nods from management. He unhooked his heavy metal handcuffs from his tactical belt with a cruel, eager glint in his dull eyes and lunged forward through the crowd toward us, shoving bystanders aside with his massive shoulders like a bull clearing a pen. "Stand still and put your hands behind your back. You fraud!" he growled entirely, ignoring any semblance of protocol entirely, ignoring my military identification still sitting on the counter in plain sight, entirely ignoring the fact that a small child was pressed against my legs with tears running down his face. He did not care about evidence. He did not care about procedure or due process. He cared about showing off for the cameras and earning his boss's approval. As he swung the heavy steel cuffs forward in a wide, undisciplined arc to force my immediate compliance, his massive rough forearm grazed dangerously, terrifyingly close to my son's face. The boy flinched hard, pulling his head back just in time. His cheek felt the displaced air from the guard's swinging arm. The metal cuffs whistled past his ear. Time froze completely, as the threat of physical harm against my child registered in my brain like a detonation code. punched into a warhead. Every nerve ending in my body ignited simultaneously. In that split second, the protective mother and the combat-hardened Marine colonel merged into a single lethal entity. My speed was beyond anything anyone standing in that lobby could have imagined. Before Marcus Vance could complete his reckless, undisciplined swing, I deflected his massive arm with a bone-jarring, perfectly angled block, using my left forearm, redirecting his momentum past my son's head without missing a single beat. I pivoted. My hip slipped inside his guard and locked his extended arm in a lightning-fast tactical joint manipulation that I had practiced 10,000 times on training mats in military bases from Quantico to Okinawa. I did not need to throw a single punch. With one precise compression of his shoulder joint and a sharp controlled twist of his wrist, applying maximum calculated leverage against his weakest anatomical points, I forced the security guard, a man standing nearly 2 meters tall and outweighing me by at least 100 pounds, to roar in agony. His entire body folded under the immense targeted pressure. He crashed down one knee, slamming hard into the marble floor with a sickening heavy thud. He was completely immobilized, stripped of all ability to resist in less than 3 seconds. The crowd gasped as one collective terrified body. The giant had been neutralized by a single precise movement from a woman, half his size in scuffed combat boots. Instead of recognizing the horrifying magnitude of her mistake, instead of realizing that she had just ordered an armed guard to swing metal restraints within inches of a child's face, my sister pounced on the narrative like a rabid animal smelling blood. She pointed her manicured finger at my defensive takedown and screamed to the filming mob, desperately gaslighting every single witness in the room, rewriting reality in real time. You all see it now. She has lost her mind. She clearly has severe PTSD from the military. She snorts, is a violent psychopath, an uncontrollable killing machine. Her voice cracked with theatrical hysteria. But her eyes were calculating, cold, and fully aware of the narrative she was manufacturing for the cameras. She snorts was turning my service, my sacrifice, my scars into a weapon against me. She was diagnosing me in front of a mob. It was the most sickening betrayal imaginable, weaponizing my trauma, weaponizing my training, turning the years I had spent defending this nation into evidence of insanity. Having neutralized the immediate threat, I released the guard instantly. I kicked his handcuffs across the marble floor, sending them spinning under the counter and out of reach. Anyone who dares lay a single finger on my son, I swear I will break their arm, I roared my command voice, vibrating the glass teller partitions hard enough to rattle the pens in their holders and send a stack of deposit slips cascading off the counter. I immediately stepped back from the gasping, whimpering guard, sprawled on the floor, and dropped my arms loose against my sides, palms, open fingers spread, facing outward. It was the absolute textbook open palm posture of a trained officer in full deliberate surrender. A universal visual declaration captured by every camera in the room, proving that I was not a wild attacker. I was a disciplined combat officer in total rational control who had used the minimum necessary force to protect her child from an armed aggressor. The remaining security guards formed a menacing tight half-circle around us, their crackling blue stun batons drawn and arsing with live electricity. They forced me step by step backward toward the heavy glass entrance doors. Behind the counter, Maya was weeping into her hands, completely shattered by her inability to help her body curled against the filing cabinets. The cowardly crowd of bystanders remained dead silent, entirely apathetic, their camera flashes blinding us from every angle as they consumed our trauma for entertainment without lifting a single finger to intervene. Not one person put their phone down. Not one person said, "Stop." My son buried his tears-soaked face directly into my thigh. His tiny shoulders shook violently against my leg. Slowly, he turned his head and looked up through the forest of hostile strangers surrounding us, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. His voice cracked with a grief so profound and so raw, it could shatter every pane of glass in that building. "Mom, you fought and bled to protect them. So why will none of them stand up to protect you now?" My clear throat steel heart physically broke inside my chest. The sound that came out of my son's mouth was not a question. It was an indictment of every single person in that room. Every person who had chosen comfort over courage, spectacle over decency, content over compassion. He had seen the ugliest truth of the civilian world at 8 years old, and no amount of military discipline, no amount of training or sacrifice or deployments could ever shield him from it again. I crouched, slightly, stroking his hair, using my body to block the relentless camera flashes from his swollen, ringed eyes. "It is okay, sweetheart. We do not need protection from cowards," I whispered against the top of his head, holding my chin high as the final countdown to our reckoning began. If hearing a crying child ask why society turns its back on its truest protectors shatters your heart, hit the like button right now. Share in the comments if you have ever stood completely alone against a malicious judging crowd, because the explosive karma that happens next is the ultimate payback. The remaining security guards tightened their half circle, their crackling stun batons carving blue arcs through the lobby air like electric fences closing in on livestock. They systematically forced me step by step backward toward the glass entrance, their boots squeaking on the polished marble. I held my ground with absolute discipline, keeping my son entirely tucked behind my body to shield him from both the weapons and the relentless glare of the smartphone lenses. The collective silence of the dozens of onlookers was absolutely deafening. Not a murmur of dissent. Not a single voice raised an objection. It was a collective grotesque moral failure recorded in pristine high definition. A room full of adults watching a veteran mother and her crying child be herded toward the exit by armed corporate security and choosing to film it instead of stop it. I focused my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale in a slow rhythmic pattern, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, locking my overwhelming rage deep within a reinforced vault in my skull. I was silently calculating the seconds until the flashing lights of the police cruisers would appear in the parking lot to drag me away in handcuffs, mentally preparing my son for the nightmare of watching his mother forced into the back of a squad car in front of a cheering mob. Then, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. Every molecule of air seemed to rearrange itself. A massive, imposing shadow eclipsed the late afternoon light, pouring through the glass entrance behind me. The heavy automated doors slid open, with a sharp mechanical hiss that cut through the electric crackle of the batons like a blade through silk. Richard Sterling, the CEO and chairman of Holstead Bank, strode confidently into the lobby. He was flanked by 4 members of his elite legal team, all wearing identical jet black suits, all carrying leather document folders embossed with the bank's gold crest. He had not come to this branch for a casual inspection or a routine audit. He had arrived personally to secure the highly classified $750 million Department of Defense pension contract. A colossal life-saving deal. He had spent 6 agonizing months negotiating behind closed doors in Washington to rescue his corporation's plunging stock price from catastrophic freefall. He had flown in from New York on his private jet, expecting a red carpet welcome, chilled champagne, and a quiet signing ceremony with the military's top representative in his most prestigious branch. As Richard crossed the threshold, his polished diplomatic smile froze solid on his face. His sharp, experienced eyes, the eyes of a man who had survived 3 recessions and 2 hostile takeovers, scanned the chaotic, violent scene unfolding in his VIP lobby. He saw the shredded white confetti of the $5 million check scattered across the marble floor. He saw his security guards brandishing live electrical weapons at a woman in a military jacket. He saw the filming crowd. He saw the guard groaning on the floor, clutching his wrist, and then his gaze landed dead on me. His most vital, untouchable VIP client, the sole authorized signatory of a $750 million government contract, cornered against the glass entrance of his own bank like a violent criminal, with a crying child pressed against her legs. The sheer horrifying reality of what his staff had just done short-circuited his brain. His hands went limp. His fingers lost all strength. The crocodile leather briefcase, containing the signed contract of the century, slipped from his grip and crashed to the marble floor with a heavy dry thud that echoed through the frozen lobby like a gunshot in a cathedral. Every head turned, every camera pivoted. The sound of that expensive leather hitting stone cracked the room open like a geological fault line, and the earthquake was just beginning. The CEO's chest heaved with an apocalyptic fury as his mind rapidly processed the monumental catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. His bank had just physically attacked, publicly humiliated, and attempted to arrest the very entity that held their entire financial survival in its hands. The blood rushed to his face, turning his expression into a mask of pure terror and volcanic rage. His booming voice exploded across the vaulted marble ceiling with enough force to rattle the crystal chandeliers and paralyze every guard, every teller, every cowardly bystander and my sister in a single devastating blast. "Colonel Price, what the hell is going on in my bank branch?" The sheer terror and desperate respect packed into those words hit the crowd like a physical shockwave, instantly shattering the arrogant illusion my sister had spent the last 20 minutes constructing with her bare manicured hands. The truth had finally walked through the door at the thunderous sound of the CEO screaming my military rank. The entire power dynamic of the room inverted in a fraction of a second. The towering security guard, Marcus Vance, dropped his stun baton as if the handle had erupted into flames, and scrambled backward in sheer unadulterated terror, nearly tripping over his own boots. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just physically assaulted a high-ranking federal officer and swung metal handcuffs within inches of her child's face. Meanwhile, my sister began hyperventilating. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. She could not process what she was hearing. She rushed forward toward the CEO, plastering a twisted, manic, utterly fake smile across her ashen face. She babbled a frantic stream of desperate lies, gesturing wildly with her hands, claiming she had just heroically intercepted a deranged, violent fraudster attempting to steal bank funds. She expected accommodation. She expected applause. She expected the CEO to shake her hand and praise her vigilance. The Richard Sterling did not even acknowledge her existence. He strode right past her outstretched hands as if she were a piece of lobby furniture, marching directly to where I stood, shielding my son against the glass. The billionaire CEO stopped in front of my scuffed combat boots, straightened his posture to its full height, and bowed his head deeply respectfully. He apologized profusely for the grotesque, unforgivable incompetence of his staff, his voice cracking with genuine fury, shame, and the unmistakable sound of a man watching his empire crumble because of one branch manager's arrogance. Having offered his apologies to me, Richard spun around on his polished heel and aimed a lethal, uncompromising glare directly at my sister. The veins in his neck and temples bulged. He pointed a shaking finger down at the shredded remnants of the $5 million check scattered across the marble floor. His voice boomed with enough force to vibrate the glass teller partitions and send the remaining deposit slips fluttering off the counter. "The woman you just humiliated, whose check you just shredded, and whom you called to the police to arrest, is Colonel Lauren Price, Senior Representative of the United States Department of Defense. She snorts holds sole authority over the $750 million pension contract that is the only thing keeping this bank alive. And that $5 million check you tore to pieces was legitimate government funding verified and confirmed through official channels by email this morning. You did not just destroy federal property. You slandered a decorated military hero of this nation." The magnitude of his revelation hit the filming crowd like a physical shockwave. The smartphones that had been recording a crazy beggar being rightfully ejected were now capturing a decorated military colonel being brutally abused by a corrupt elitist banking system run by her own sister. The narrative flipped so violently and so completely it gave the entire room whiplash. Faces went white, phones lowered, mouths fell open. The man in the poorly fitted suit, who had mocked my son, retreated silently into the back of the crowd, trying to disappear. The blood drained entirely from my sister's perfectly powdered face, leaving her looking like a hollow corpse standing upright in a designer suit. The cowardly mob of onlookers instantly lowered their phones, backing away in stunned, humiliating shame. Suddenly, and violently confronted by their own complicity in the abuse they had gleefully documented. My sister's aristocratic mask, carefully constructed over decades of false superiority, practiced cruelty and obsessive status chasing, shattered into absolute dust before my eyes. Her jaw went slack, her knees buckled, her body crumpled. She collapsed to the marble floor, trembling violently, crawling on her hands and knees toward me. She grabbed at the hem of my combat pants, with shaking, desperate fingers, her manicured nails scraping against the faded olive fabric, clinging to the very uniform she had mocked and spit on just minutes earlier. The sight was pathetic beyond any description language could provide. The woman, who had sneered at my clothes, torn my government check into confetti, threatened my ally, ordered a guard to swing metal cuffs at my child, and screamed for the police to arrest me, was now sobbing uncontrollably on the cold marble floor, begging for mercy. She used the family tie, the one she had spent her entire adult life mocking, denying, and weaponizing. She called me sister. She called me family. She used every word she had spent 45 years refusing to mean. I looked down at her weeping, pathetic form clinging to my boots. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph, just a clinical void. The kind of terrifying emotional emptiness that settles in after a long battle when the adrenaline bleeds out and all that remains is the cold, sterile arithmetic of consequences that cannot be undone. My voice dropped to absolute zero, slicing through her hysterical sobs like a surgical blade cutting through infected tissue. The military taught me to risk my life to protect this nation and its people, but it absolutely never taught me to tolerate corruption, cruelty, and discrimination, even if the perpetrator shares my own blood. I pulled my leg back, breaking her grip on my uniform forever. The fabric tore slightly where her crimson nails had dug in. I did not look down at her again. I looked up, locking eyes with the CEO, standing 3 feet away, and issued the final non-negotiable strike. I demand the immediate termination of Natalie Price and head of security Marcus Vance. Strip their employee badges and hand them over to the police. There would be no second chances, no private resignations, no quiet settlements negotiated behind closed doors with expensive lawyers. I was cutting the rod out publicly and permanently under the gaze of every camera in that lobby, under the weight of every shredded piece of that $5 million check still scattered across the floor around my boots. Within minutes, the wailing sirens of local police and specialized military police units swarmed the bank's main entrance, their red and blue lights reflecting endlessly across the massive glass facade like a violent light show. Really, they had been dispatched expecting to subdue a deranged criminal. Instead, upon seeing my rank displayed on the counter, hearing the CEO's furious, detailed testimony, and reviewing the security camera footage that showed Marcus Vance swinging handcuffs at a child, the heavily armed officers immediately lowered their weapons and snapped sharp, respectful salutes. My sister, stripped of her employee badge and every manufactured shred of her authority, was walked out of the building in heavy steel handcuffs. She screamed hysterically as they formally read her the charges: filing false police reports, attempted extortion, intentional destruction of government property, assault by proxy. The cowardly security guard Marcus Vance was shoved roughly into the back of a second police cruiser right behind her. His brief, brutal reign of bullying permanently terminated with a click of steel around his thick wrists. By evening, the bystanders' videos had leaked across every social media platform on the internet, but the narrative had violently and irreversibly flipped. The footage of a branch manager tearing a charity check, ordering armed guards to attack a veteran mother and her crying child, and then gaslighting the entire room by screaming about PTSD went catastrophically viral. Major news networks ran it as their lead story. Cable news panels dissected it for hours. Holsted Bank stock plunged into a terrifying freefall on Wall Street as the public launched a massive, unrelenting boycott campaign against the institution's documented culture of discrimination and cruelty. The elite financial corporation was suddenly facing the worst existential crisis in its century-long history, completely paralyzed by a backlash that no amount of money lawyers or crisis management consultants could contain or buy their way out of. The apathy of the filming crowd, The very weapon my sister had counted on to validate her cruelty had become the gasoline that was burning her empire to the foundation. Later that night, while dozens of screaming news vans and aggressive reporters camped outside the small front window of my modest wooden house on the edge of Maple Hollow, I sat completely alone in the dim light of my kitchen. My son was finally asleep in his room, his dinosaur backpack still clutched against his chest, his face still puffy and streaked from hours of crying. The only sound in the house was the lonely, quiet ticking of the old clock mounted above the stove, each second falling like a small stone dropped into deep, still water. I stared blankly at my faded, scuffed uniform hanging over the back of the wooden kitchen chair, the same chair I had been leaning against when my ex-husband delivered his final verdict on our marriage years ago. A framed photograph of Natalie and me as children, maybe 6 and 9 years old, sat on the shelf above the sink. I reached up, took it down, and placed it face down on the counter without looking at it again. I felt absolutely no joy in my sister's destruction, no triumph, no vindication. The silence in the house was heavy, suffocating, loaded with the weight of something permanent and irreversible. I had successfully severed my toxic bloodline forever. The sister who once braided my hair before school, the girl who shared my bedroom for 16 years, the person who was supposed to be the one constant in a brutal, unforgiving world was gone, hauled away in handcuffs on live television while the nation watched, watching a family member be dragged out of a building in steel restraints. Even one who earned every charge filed against her leaves, a permanent cold scar that no amount of public praise, viral support, or presidential commendations can ever heal. As I sat alone in the dark kitchen, my son's tearful, shattering question echoed endlessly against the walls of my skull. "You fought to protect them, so why will none of them stand up to protect you now?" The horrific truth crashed over me like a rogue wave in open ocean. If I had not possessed that massive $750 million contract as a shield, I would be rotting in a concrete holding cell, at that very moment, fingerprinted and booked, crushed and forgotten. While my sister celebrated her victory with champagne in her corner office, and my son sat in a foster care intake room, wondering where his mother had gone. A normal wounded veteran, a soldier, without a multi-million-dollar weapon in her pocket, would have been dragged out of that bank in chains, while the crowd cheered and uploaded the footage for likes and shares. The entire system was fundamentally rotten to its core. Punishing one malicious branch manager was satisfying, but it was not nearly enough to cure the disease, eating the institution alive. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table until my knuckles turned white. My war was far from over. It had just begun. I had to use my leverage to tear the corrupt corporate structure down to its foundation and rebuild it from the ground up, ensuring no veteran, no soldier's child ever faced this kind of institutional cruelty and public humiliation again. 3 days after the disastrous incident, Richard Sterling and the most powerful members of his terrified board of directors arrived at my front door in a convoy of black luxury sedans that looked absurdly out of place on my gravel driveway. They squeezed nervously around my cheap, scratched kitchen table, sweating through their bespoke designer suits in my tiny, unair-conditioned kitchen, while my old ceiling fan wobbled and clicked above their heads. The coffee I served them was from a store-brand can. The mugs had chips in the rims. Desperate to stop the media firestorm that was rapidly bankrupting their empire, they slid thick envelopes across the scarred wooden surface toward me. Inside were multi-million-dollar personal settlement checks, essentially blank checks to compensate for my pain and suffering, with enough zeros to buy a private island and a fleet of helicopters. They pleaded with me, practically begging, their voices cracking with desperation, asking me to legally sign the pension deal, issue a forgiving press statement to the major networks, and call off the boycott that was hemorrhaging their stock price by the hour. They believed that just like my sister, everyone had a price. They were convinced that enough zeros on a check could erase the stain of institutional cruelty and buy the silence of a decorated Marine colonel. I looked down at the staggering numbers on the hush money check spread across my kitchen table. Without blinking, Without hesitation, I shoved them forcefully back across the scarred wood. One envelope slid off the edge and landed on the cracked linoleum floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. "I do not sell my silence for money, Soph," I stated with absolute chilling finality, watching the panic bloom across their expensive, moisturized faces like ink spreading through water. Firing one arrogant branch manager like my sister does not change the apathy of the entire system you have all been enabling. I made it perfectly clear that my integrity forged in the fires of military service across 3 combat deployments, 18 years of active duty, and the loss of more brothers and sisters in arms than I could count, without my voice breaking, was not for sale. Not today, not ever. I was not merely angry at Natalie. I was disgusted to my core by the entire corporate culture that had allowed a predator like her to thrive, to bully, to discriminate, and to abuse the vulnerable with total impunity for years, while every single person in a position of authority looked the other way and counted their quarterly bonuses. I reached into the folder sitting beside my chipped coffee mug and slammed my own typed ultimatum onto the kitchen table. The heavy paper hit the wood with a crack that made 2 of the board members physically recoil in their leather chairs. 3. I listed my demands in the same clipped, non-negotiable cadence I used when issuing military orders in the field, each one punctuated by the ticking of the kitchen clock above the stove. The bank must immediately implement a policy providing free comprehensive banking services for every veteran and military family nationwide across every single branch, effective within 30 days. They must establish a fully independent hotline for reporting discrimination staffed by external auditors who answer to absolutely no one inside the corporation. They must conduct a complete internal purge of every associate supervisor and ally that Natalie had placed, promoted, or protected during her corrupt tenure as branch manager. They must immediately promote and provide a full management scholarship to Maya Jenkins, the brave young teller who was the only person in that entire building with enough moral courage and basic human decency to stand up for the truth when everyone else chose silence. And finally, they must permanently establish the Leo Price Scholarship Fund, named after my son, dedicated to providing full educational funding for the children of fallen soldiers, financed in perpetuity by Holstead Bank's annual corporate profits. Cornered, bleeding cash by the hour, their stock in catastrophic freefall, facing the largest consumer boycott in American banking history, and completely, utterly desperate to survive. The board of directors signed every single demand without a moment of hesitation. Richard Sterling's hand trembled visibly as he initialed the final page and slid it back across my scratched kitchen table. 3 months later, the media storms had finally receded. The news vans were gone from my street. The reporters had moved on. The gravel driveway was quiet again. And once more, I held my son's small hand and walked through the front doors of the Ellsworth Bank branch. I was still wearing that exact same faded scuffed combat jacket, the same boots, the same cargo pants, the same dinosaur backpack hung from my son's shoulder, its torn zipper still unrepaired. Nothing about us had changed, but the bank itself had been fundamentally, irrevocably reborn. Polished brass plaques honoring veterans of every branch of the United States Armed Forces hung proudly on the marble walls that had once radiated nothing but cold, silent classist contempt. A framed copy of the Veteran Service Commitment, the policy I had forced into existence at my kitchen table, was displayed prominently behind the teller counter in a handsome case of dark walnut and beveled glass. And standing behind that counter, wearing the sharp-tailored charcoal suit of an assistant branch manager, her name badge gleaming under the refurbished lights, was Maya Jenkins. She saw us walk in. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears that caught the light and ran freely down her cheeks, radiating a gratitude so raw and so deep it could melt forged steel. I squeezed my son's hand tightly as we walked across the same marble floor where shredded paper had once covered my boots like snow at a funeral. He looked up at me. He did not ask why the people were smiling this time. He did not ask why the security guard at the door nodded respectfully. He did not need to ask. He already understood. I had finally shown him the only lesson that truly mattered. The one no classroom, no textbook, no sermon could ever teach. True power is not meant to crush your enemies for petty revenge. True power exists to forge an unbreakable shield for the innocent, and to force a cruel, indifferent world to change its ways. One institution at a time, one demand at a time, one act of stubborn, bleeding, unyielding courage at a time. If you believe that true power is about protecting the weak rather than seeking revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below to share how you have stood up against toxic systems in your own